And hello once again, and welcome to another of these lecture videos about literature stuffs. This one is going to be about post-structuralist theatre. My name is Elsie Lupus, and let us get into post-structuralism. But before we do get into this, let me just say, I've been making these videos for quite a long time, made quite a lot of them, and I'm making quite a few more of them. If you appreciate this kind of work, you can always support me by checking out my books or my Patreon. But we're going to move on from now and get into post-structuralist theatre. First off, what is post-structuralism? Okay. Post-structuralism can be kind of difficult to define. It has a relation to postmodernism. They're not the same thing, though. That is something to keep in mind. Post-structuralism and postmodernism are not the same, but they are related to one another. Post-structuralism generally has to do with self-reflectiveness, a denial of previously assumed assumptions about sort of authority and reality. It is also, a lot of the time when you go into post-structuralist literature, it is the denial of a concept of originality, sort of saying that nothing can be truly original. Everything is essentially just an intertextual mesh comprised of everything else, right? Books are not unique and original, they are actually just comprised of what you have learned from other books that are then just brought together in this kind of a systematized way. So, it is important to keep in mind, though, that it can be quite difficult to have a definitive definition because people can add things to it. So we're going to instead look at a bunch of the characteristics and the types of things that you might find in post-structuralist theatre to give you a better understanding. So, something that you'll often find is the idea of repetition and recycling, right? The imitation of existing forms, existing texts, existing histories, existing whatevers, right? You'll get things like rewriting and stuff like that. So, common things are things like parody and pastiche, which are important to understand as distinct concepts. A parody is something that's generally critical, often mocking, but not always. Like, a parody doesn't have to be mocking, but it's usually critical of whatever it is parodying, right? But remember, when you usually think of a parody, you usually think of those, like, rip-off movies, those parody movies, like a Scary Movie or something like that, right? You think of those, Scary Movie, the superhero movie, the epic movie. There were a whole bunch of them in the 2000s. Those kinds of movies were parodying existing movies and compiling them together into just something very silly, right? It was kind of mocking them and then also rendering them into something just sillier than they actually were. Right, that is a parody. It's sort of a parody of multiple things altogether. But you can get parodies of anything. You also get more sophisticated parodies. So, say if you take something like the film Walk Hard, it's essentially a parody of an entire genre, rather than being a parody of anything in particular. It draws heavy inspiration from certain specific films, but it does have its own parodic sense of an entire genre that it's making fun of. In that case, it's essentially mocking and critiquing the Oscar Bates style musician biopic, right? So it's sort of making fun of that. Now, that's a parody, correct? Whereas a pastiche is something that's more like paying homage or just drawing inspiration from something, but also making that more apparent, right? So, you can get pastiche in all sorts of things. Sometimes it's very, very obvious and sometimes it isn't. So you could take something like Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, which has a lot of parallels and a lot of sort of allusions to existing literary works. For instance, the main character, who I think is called William, it's like William of Baskerville. He is basically like a monk detective, and his name directly calls to mind Sherlock Holmes because of the Hound of Baskervilles. So basically, it is this sort of pastiche. It's a network of created concepts that are all coming together to sort of imitate something, to create something new out of imitation. So sort of think of these as imitations of imitations a lot of the time, right? You're imitating something, but the reason that you're taking something original and making something non-original, or rather taking something non-original, making your own something that's sort of original based on pre-existing texts, is an interesting idea, right? It's a thing that is calling very, very close attention to the fact that everything is based on something else. Everything draws inspiration from somewhere else. But pastiche and parody are, rather than hiding that, they're very, very much showing that. You could take something like Hamlet Machine is probably a really good example. Hamlet Machine is it's a short play that uses Hamlet, the Shakespearean play, as a central grounding point, but then basically does all sorts of other things that are not related to Hamlet. Okay, so parody and pastiche, but now you get some other things. A major thing is appropriation. So basically taking from other places for multiple reasons. So why would they do this? Well, there are aesthetic functions to this, critical or reflexive functions, and also political functions. So if I take a text, right, and I want to recontextualize it and basically just use its aesthetics, I'm essentially copying the aesthetics that it used for my own purposes. So I want to have aesthetics being used for a certain reason, but I'm going to basically take them from another place and use them in my own work. Right? You're retextualizing them, and you're kind of denying the originality of your own text through the appropriation of another text. It's not copying. It's not like you're pretending that you're not pretending. You're not pretending that, oh, I made up this idea. You know, take someone like Tarantino is really, really good at this kind of thing, where he appropriates existing films to create his own sort of pastiche of something different and new. Right? He is retextualizing these sort of, say, old genres or something to do something new with them. Right? The more you understand film history, the more you'd appreciate something like Tarantino, because you'll see all the places where he essentially just, like, say, copied shots or entire plot lines where he did things that were from existing places, but now recontextualized into a new format. Now, you could also do it, that's more of an aesthetic reason. You could also do it for a critical reason, right? If you wanted to do a rewrite of some description of something, like, say, Shakespeare's The Tempest, you could be doing that for post-colonial, anti-colonial reasons. You could be essentially rewriting it to critique the original text or to critique the thinking that came out of a text like that. Right? So you can basically take something and rework it so that you can criticize the original thing, or the original culture that led to the thing. Right? So, like, imagine someone taking, I don't know, a book that's extremely racist, and then reworking that book to instead be a critique of racism. Right? It's no longer a racist text, it is now a text that is anti-racism. It is going against the original thing, which also has a political function. You could be appropriating elements to have a certain political, you might have a political motivation, you might have a specific reason that you're doing this, right? So, right, the critical thing could be, okay, this was a racist text, I'm going to take it and then rework it into something that is not, right? It's something that is instead critical of it, and that also has a political function of now interrogating the original interpretation that you might have had of the thing, whatever the thing happens to be, right? So basically, think of it like that. Appropriation has many different reasons. Are you appropriating elements from existing texts so that you can have a similar aesthetic? Or are you taking it because you want to have some kind of a criticism of that thing? Or a political leaning? Now, these apply to much more than theater, but that's because this particular module is theater. But you can apply it to film, you can apply it to books, whatever. It doesn't actually matter. Post-structuralism exists outside of theater. But in this case, we're just going to be looking at the theater, sort of, well, framing it as being about theater. Okay, so now, something that's very, very major in post-structuralist everything is intertextuality. Right? Intertextuality is essentially critiquing, not critiquing, it's sort of the existence of texts within texts. That's the basic thing. Intertext. Intertext is one text existing in another text, which could be for many reasons. Right? You could have, say, something like Reza de Wet's play, something grond, about the ground. I can't remember what it's called. Whatever. It's Reza de Wet plays a South African playwright, and she wrote a play where the characters perform Everyman. So basically, Everyman is a famous medieval play. We don't know the exact authorship of it, but basically, the characters put on a real play, right? To understand that play, you kind of need to also understand Everyman, because it uses Everyman to explain things. It's the same with the play, which is The Island, which was written by a couple of people, Athol Fugard, John Carney, I can't remember the third guy, but basically the three of them wrote this play together, and in that play, the characters put on, it's set in a prison on Robben Island, which is very much specifically South African history, and they put on Antigone, which is a play by Sophocles, this ancient Greek play, which is basically about rebellion against the government, against what rules the government sort of had in place. So it is then used to do something else, right? It is used to now, you're using an existing text to critique something else. You're using this intertext. Okay, so that's an intertext. Then you get palimpsest, which is basically where you've taken so many intertextual things that it becomes that you can't even really remember where the original comes from, right? You've taken inspirations from inspirations from inspirations. And this is just how literature works, right? You might read something without realizing that that book was inspired by a different book. But that book was inspired by a different book. But that book was inspired by a different book. So it's essentially, you have this chain of influence that you might not even be aware of. So you might be referencing things that you don't even know are references, sort of reference to reference rather than references to something that's real. Imitations of imitations, basically. So palimpsest is just a trace of the original exists because it's been essentially so intertextually copied over and over again. You get a bunch of plays that do this kind of thing. Some sort of texts, like I'm trying to think of specific ones where only a trace remains. There's something like some of the work of like Willem Anker incorporates certain elements like this, where yes, it's strictly speaking based on like Kafka, but it has deviated so far that sort of it doesn't really exist in its original form. Only a trace of that original exists. You might take a name or something from somewhere and just use that name, even though it doesn't really relate to it, right? So like traces exist. It's very up in the air. Everything's sort of very vague. Then you get intertextuality as rhizome. This is the idea that the referent is lost in infinite intertext. There's kind of a similarity with palimpsest here, where it's kind of infinite. You don't know where everything comes from. Now, just to explain what a rhizome is, a rhizomatic structure comes from the work of two people that I hate, Deleuze and Guattari. The rhizome is basically a way of thinking about thought, but also literature. So when you think of a rhizome, you might be familiar with that term if you do biology, or have ever done biology in school or whatever. A rhizome is a type of sort of root structure. It's not actually a root, but it's kind of like a root structure where it's kind of plants that connect to each other along a sort of a horizontal array. The idea of rhizomatic structures in literature is that basically there's so many ideas crisscrossing on top of each other that you can't really tell where the origin point is. Where does it come from? You don't know, because it's so many different so many different influences all crisscrossing with each other that it's impossible to pinpoint a definitive starting point. There's no root, there is a rhizome. It spreads out into near infinity or actual infinity, right? So it's an infinite intertext. You don't know where things come from because no one necessarily knows where these things come from. That is a sort of rhizomatic explanation of this idea. Okay, so that's intertextually as rhizome. Then you get historicity. So this is reworking reality for fictional purposes. Now, the actual example that they give in the study guide here is about the Tarantino film Inglourious Basterds, which takes fictional characters and puts them into a very historical place and also changes history to accommodate them, right? Because in that, the main characters kill Hitler. Hitler doesn't, shoot himself in that story. He is explicitly killed by people. So, right, the history is changed to tell a different story, to tell an alternate history story. You can find this in all sorts of texts where history is broken down to tell some kind of a different narrative. Alright, so that's historicity in post-structuralist texts and theatre. Then you get deconstruction, which is basically destabilization of existing norms. I'm going to take a play or a story of any description, and you're going to think it's normal at first, like it's going to be very typical, right? And then it breaks down into something else. So take like a good example could be any kind of a text. Okay, I'm going to say some kind of random examples that people might not know. So something like Invincible is a deconstruction of the superhero genre, because you expect it to be a typical, or at least if you're unfamiliar with the story going in, you would watch it and then you would think, oh, this is a typical superhero story, and then everything breaks down and it becomes something very different. The Boys is actually also a deconstruction of the superhero genre. At first, you might think, oh, it's a world with superheroes, and then it turns out to all be wrong. Something like Neon Genesis Evangelion is a deconstruction of the mecha genre. You're watching this anime thinking, oh, it's a mecha anime. I know what happens here. And then everything starts breaking down, right? It's a deconstruction of what you expected to happen. Now, the last one here is the representation as simulation, which is a hyper-reality concept. Hyper-reality is sort of the idea of something being more than reality. The text becomes something that subverts reality itself and maybe becomes its own reality, which is very fun. Something like, say, The Matrix is sort of an idea of hyper-reality. You know, the fiction becomes more than reality. It's hyper-realistic. So it's more than realism. It goes beyond it. It's sort of its simulation becomes real. So yeah. So as you can tell by all of these different random things that are all basically about breaking down the ideas of what is original and mixing things up and everything, which makes post-structuralism quite far-reaching and also kind of complicated in the sense that it can be difficult to pinpoint a specific definition. Like, is post-structuralism specifically the denial of textual originality? Not necessarily, because sometimes it will reinforce that idea or break that idea. There's many different things it could be doing. These are different possibilities that could be explored through post-structuralist theatre or other post-structuralist works. So, if you're writing about post-structuralism, you can, instead of giving a definitive definition, you can kind of come up with your own definition, actually, and sort of work towards your own understanding of it, but keep these kinds of concepts in mind. The intertextual concepts, the repetition concepts, the self-reflectivity, the critical angle, the political angle, all of these sort of things, keep them in mind when looking at post-structuralist theatre and post-structuralist literature in general. So, yeah, hopefully this was probably confusing a lot of the time, but hopefully beneficial. So if you did appreciate it, you can, and if you want to support me, you can check out my books, or you can support me on Patreon. And yeah, this is going to be the final year of these unscripted but semi-structured lectures about these literature topics, because I'm going to finish the rest of the entire subject this year. And so if you appreciate that kind of stuff, you can support me. And if you can't monetarily, or you don't want to, you hate me, you never know, you can always like, comment, subscribe, do those kind of things. It'll be very helpful. And yeah, so otherwise, hope you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and goodbye.